I hope that now I have your attention and that you're really interested in what this new way of doing things, the JAMstack, is really all about. So in this video, let's take a look at what is the JAMstack. To start off, let's take a look at a diagram kind of explaining the overall flow of a JAMstack application. In the course overview video, we looked at a simplified version of this diagram, but now you're going to notice that it has a few extra pieces. Let's start at the top with the Git repo. This is going to be a GitHub repository that contains all the files necessary for our application. By storing them all on GitHub, we ensure that we're tracking all of the changes throughout our application over time, and it ensures that our content is always up to date. So our GitHub repository is going to contain all of our JavaScript APIs and markup that make up the jam of the JAMstack. If we move over to the side, you'll see Headless CMS. CMS stands for Content Management System. You may be familiar with a couple examples of CMSs like WordPress or Contentful. These are systems that manage all of the content in your application, like all of the articles in a blogging application or all of the products in an e-commerce application. The term Headless CMS simply means that our content is not directly tied to its output. In systems like WordPress, you enter all of your content into the system, but you also have to explicitly define how that content is going to be presented on the page. That means within the CMS, you also have to set up where the content is going to go and what it's going to look like. With a headless CMS, the front end and the back end are decoupled. Essentially, you have non-developers, like the editors or authors writing your articles, enter in the content into the CMS, and then the CMS produces structured data that us developers can then use to manipulate and display however we want. This actually also means that you could have multiple front ends, since it's decoupled, such as a web application and a native mobile application, that function separately but pull all of their data from that same headless CMS backend. This enables some really powerful behavior, but we'll get more into that later. So now that you have all of your JavaScript APIs and markup, which is going to be your React code, and then you have your headless CMS with all of your content ready, those are both going to feed in to the static site generator, like Next.js or Gatsby. These static site generators will go through your React code, your JavaScript APIs and markup, and then it will go through the content management system and create all of the pieces of the application that are necessary, such as creating all of the pages for your blog posts or your products. This is all done at build time, so that when your user goes and requests the page for /hoodies, your site doesn't have to actually go and make a request to the database to look up what all the hoodies are. It is going to, at build time, go and look up all the hoodies and then create pages for all of them automatically, which will then already be ready for your user as they were statically generated. And so it will simply then be served directly without another request to the CMS. Now, what's even more powerful about this pattern is you can set up your headless CMS to notify your static site generator whenever certain things change, such as whenever somebody writes a new blog post and that needs to be uploaded to the site. And so you will have what's called a webhook set up from your headless CMS to the static site generator to let it know something has changed, and then a new version of the static site will be built. The same goes for your JavaScript APIs and markup, since it's all stored in a Git repository. Whenever we push a new change to our Git repo, that tells the static site generator that it needs to trigger a new build as well. Once your static files are built, they are then uploaded to a CDN, a content delivery network. As I briefly mentioned in the course overview video, this is essentially a globally distributed set of servers, allowing your users to connect to whichever one is fastest and closest to them instead of having all of your traffic directed to one place. This really speeds things up for your users and enables really powerful caching patterns and other stuff that we'll get into, but all you need to know is this makes it very fast for your users and also makes it really easy to scale. The last part of this diagram is our actual client interacting with the CDN and the services. These services are things like cloud functions, which you might be familiar with from Firebase or Netlify cloud functions. And these are simply small pieces of functionality that allow us to perform certain tasks without having to manage the actual server that these functions are running on. So instead of having an entire backend, you just define a single lightweight function for whatever operation you want to perform and then access that like an API. So that's a good summary for the flow of a JAMstack application, and hopefully you're already really starting to see the benefits over this workflow over having to create the same HTML over and over as with the previous monolithic architecture. So we just went through the flow of a JAMstack application, but let's just define a few more things about what the JAMstack is. So first, let's talk about static versus dynamic sites, because we've been talking about static files and static site generators as an integral part of what a JAMstack application is. Now, I've noticed that there's some confusion about what a static versus dynamic site actually is. A static site does not mean that nothing on the page ever changes, or that no content can ever be updated. It also does not mean that the site cannot include animations or have other moving parts on the page. What we're talking about when we're talking about static versus dynamic sites is what the server is doing, not just what the page is doing. You might think that you wouldn't be able to have something like reviews on a static site, because people can add new reviews and then those would need to be dynamically generated and displayed, right? Well, that's where the two actually start to mix, because in a static site, you can still have dynamic elements. So in this example with reviews, you would simply have all of the structure for the page with the product already filled in from your CMS, and then that would be statically generated. And then you would simply have a function on that page that when the component is mounted, it will then go and grab the current number of reviews. Now that sounds like dynamic functionality, but remember, it would truly be dynamic if every time the user went to the page, our server was recreating the HTML with the current number of reviews and then sending that directly to the user. But that's not what's happening. What we're talking about is statically generating the page and then including a function to, at runtime, go and grab the current number of reviews. That function is always going to be the same. That function is static, and then it simply handles the dynamic functionality for us. So hopefully that makes sense and that clears this up for you. JAMstack applications are also more performant than the monolithic previous architecture. Because we have these static files pre-generated for your user, it cuts out all the time that was necessary before to make database queries and run scripts and put together the HTML and then send it to the user, because all of that is done at build time and is then served directly to the user. So just by nature, they are way more performant. JAMstack applications are also much better at scaling. So if your application blows up overnight and you get 100,000 retweets on Twitter and everybody's going to check out your page, well, in previous architectures, they would probably just crash your site depending on your configuration, or it would just charge your credit card $1 billion for all the people that just went and viewed your site on your small little setup. Well, thanks to a CDN globally distributing and balancing the load of your application, you don't have to worry about ever getting overloaded. And no matter how many users you have, your application will continue to run just as smoothly. Our applications are also going to be more secure than monolithic architectures. Thanks to the fact that we're on a CDN and not one server, we don't have to worry about server-side code injection or distributed denial of service attacks, because there's not one server that they can overload with traffic, which then breaks your site and doesn't let any normal users through. Since we're on a CDN, there's no way for them to target any one server, and the traffic will always be routed to another server within the CDN. Also, thanks to the fact that we're performing all of our database queries at build time, not at runtime, the user is never actually directly interacting with our database, and so it's not vulnerable to SQL injection if you use a SQL-based database. And one of the most important factors or advantages of the JAMstack is the best developer experience that I think is out there on the web, hands down. With the JAMstack, there is absolutely nothing else but JavaScript from the front end to the back end that we'll be needing. Now, there's lots of opinions on that, but I personally really believe that having just JavaScript for everything that you do is a huge advantage, because no matter if you're coding on the back end and maybe you figure out a cool trick for working with arrays of objects, well, the next time when you're working on the front end and you have to do something similar, all those skills and tricks and tips, it's all going to transfer directly. You're always sharpening that same skill. You're always getting better at JavaScript. And that is just going to keep moving you forward and making all of your applications across the board just better and better over time. So I really see that as a huge advantage of focusing your attention and focusing the knowledge required to create really exceptional applications. So that's what the JAMstack is, but like we've talked about, the JAMstack isn't one specific set of tools. It is this concept, this architecture for putting together applications. That means that you have options for what stack you want to use. So let's take a look at what our JAMstack is going to look like. First off, we have Strapi. And I am so excited to introduce you all to Strapi and to get into it, because it is one of the most incredible tools I have ever seen. Hands down, it solves so many problems in so many amazing and incredibly convenient and clever ways that it's just going to make the entire process of backend and our CMS effortless, just totally effortless. So I'm really excited to get into that and show you guys what Strapi can do. So Strapi is going to be our headless CMS, and then it's also going to offer some APIs for us. So that's why you see the +A, because that is part of the A in our JAMstack. What makes Strapi so cool, in my opinion, is that it's essentially a backend GUI, or a dashboard, essentially, for your backend. That's going to enable us to so easily work with MongoDB and set up all of the content and data structures for our application. But not only that, Strapi also has an amazing authentication solution built into it, which kind of makes sense because authentication can control what content is delivered. So that's why I think Strapi is a really clever solution and a really powerful tool that I'm so excited to get into. Then for our JavaScript and markup, we have, of course, React and something you may or may not have heard of, Material UI. Material UI is going to provide us a component library, so a bunch of pre-built React components that are really incredible and are going to make putting together a large-scale application really easy and really convenient by providing us a lot of pieces of functionality that are common in web UIs. This also includes a layout system using the Flexbox grid and a styling system including a theming system for styling all of the components in the component library, as well as centralizing all of your own styles into a theme. Finally, it includes an incredible responsive design solution that's interwoven with the styling solution, enabling us to make sure all of our styles look perfect on all screen sizes. So that'll be really exciting to get into. If you're interested in Material UI and how you can use it to really speed up your web application development, I actually have another course completely on just Material UI, doing a really big deep dive into all the components and all the functionality, so be sure to go check that out if you're interested. For our static site generator, we are going to be using Gatsby and the GraphQL standard. So if you haven't worked with Gatsby and you haven't heard of GraphQL, you should get really excited because it's not going to be as difficult as you think. It's probably going to be a lot simpler, but the power that we're going to get out of using Gatsby and GraphQL, I think is just incredible. It's really cool. And actually, you'll get to see how we use build time GraphQL with Gatsby and runtime GraphQL with Apollo. So there will be really a lot of interesting concepts to cover there. Since this is going to be such a large application, we're going to definitely need a state management library. But instead of using Redux, we are going to completely use the React Context API. It's part of our JavaScript, and we are going to completely replicate the Redux pattern using React Context. So if you've worked with Redux before, the skills are going to transfer very easily, very directly. And if you haven't worked with Redux before, then this will be a great introduction to the pattern and how we can then use React Context to make it even simpler. One of the main services that we'll be using in our application is Stripe. This is one of the APIs in our JAMstack. And if you don't know what Stripe is one of the largest payment processing platforms on the web. They have created an incredible developer API for very easily integrating payments securely within your application. So it'll allow you to take and handle credit card payments, but put all of the burden of security onto Stripe. So that'll cover things like handling payment, storing payment methods, and sending receipts. Now, finally, the last part of our JAMstack is going to be Netlify, and this is going to be our hosting provider, and it is going to take care of all of the best practices of the JAMstack for us. Let's talk briefly about what some of those best practices are. One of the first concepts is atomic deploys. And this simply means that whenever you publish your application or whenever you create a new GitHub change and that triggers a build in your static site generator, the actual site on the CDN is not going to change until all of the files are uploaded. So if you just start going in and updating your application and all the files are being copied over and they're being copied over one by one, this can cause really weird and problematic issues with your current live deployment. So atomic deploys ensures that none of the files will ever change until all of them are ready and updated, ensuring your application is always up to date and ready to go. Along that same line is cache invalidation, which simply means that when those atomic deploys do finally go out, that we need to get rid of the old previous cached version of the site as soon as possible. So we need to go purge the cache of all the previous versions of our site and update it now with our new atomic deploy. We've mentioned a lot about the CDN, the Content Delivery Network, that is a globally distributed network of servers that is going to make sure that our site is always connecting as fast as possible to our users, no matter where in the world they are. And lastly, continuous integration / continuous development with Git. And so, like we've talked about, our entire project is going to be stored in a GitHub repository, and this allows us to automatically trigger new builds whenever we push a Git commit. And that removes all of the legwork of having to go and regenerate the site yourself and just reduces another step in the overall development process, reduces friction, and makes it easier to focus more on your application and not the underlying architecture needed to keep it running. That is a huge theme of the JAMstack itself, so that's something to really think a lot about. Now remember, Netlify is going to handle all these best practices for us automatically. There's literally nothing we have to do. That's just how Netlify works. It is built on these principles, so that is why it is the best hosting solution for JAMstack sites. So you should now have a really solid idea of what the JAMstack is and how it is going to enable us to create cutting-edge, blazing fast websites that just push the limits of what is possible with modern web development. I'm so excited to be the one to introduce this to you guys and teach you everything there is about it. So let's keep going, and in the next video, let's take our first look at the project that we're actually going to be building together.